The shilling for Dragon's Dogma 2 is getting increasingly desperate, right? It seems like this game isn't really relevant at all, so people are like reaching to extreme lengths to try and make this out to be a masterpiece, right? The thing I noticed last night was people were like showing clips of the cooking animations. Oh man, the devs couldn't get the animation to look good enough, so they just recorded footage of a real steak being cooked. Isn't that charming? Isn't that funny? Isn't that a clever way around the problem? And I'm just sitting here thinking, why don't you talk about the actual game? Like what about Dragon's Dogma 2 makes it so great? Like I don't want to hear about the inventory system or like how it's the greatest ARPG ever made. Like I want to hear what you actually do in Dragon's Dogma 2. And coincidentally, I haven't heard a single person talk about it. All it is like, oh, this is the greatest game ever. Like, this is the greatest action RPG ever made. Exactly like they did with the original Dragon's Dogma, which was trash, right? Complete trash. And the thing that gets me about this is it better than Elden Ring? That's my mindset when I look at this discourse for Dragon's Dogma 2. Oh, the best action RPG ever. Is it better than Elden Ring? Is it better than like the average FromSlop title? Because I've played both, and I can tell you there's a reason FromSlop has taken off and Dragon's Dogma has not. FromSlop has its problems, but at the very least, it isn't a generic Berserk clone. Okay, Dark Souls actually tries having unique mechanics and being a semblance of originality, right? Like it actually tries to be a little bit different. Like, what does Dragon's Dogma do? Like, oh, you can climb on monsters. Nobody cares, but it looks like Berserk. Yeah, so does FromSlop, right? So does Dark Souls. Like, well, like again, like you just see this a lot, with Dragon's Dogma fan, is that like you ask very simple questions, what makes this game great? And they just say that like, oh, Itsuno, oh, Capcom, oh, Redemption Arc, like they just do this shit, right? They just do this pointless, like brain dead, just like justification for their nonsense, right? They have no idea whatsoever what constitutes a good video game, right? None. Because that these guys, alongside the FromSoft fan base, have never played a Zelda game, right? It's the same argument, like with Skyrim, right? Like, oh, it's the greatest game ever. No, it's not. It couldn't compete with the Zelda game that came out that year, or like the long line of good Zelda games. Like, before we can talk about any of these games being good, like, can we just point out a very simple thing? Is that none of them will be able to compete with Zelda? Like, none of them. Like, Dragon's Dogma 2 is, like, not even relevant. And yet, like, guys are coming out here trying to say it's, like, the best open world fantasy game ever made, the greatest action RPG ever made, when it's not even as good as Tears of the Kingdom. It's not as good as Breath of the Wild. Like, come on, guys. Like, what are you comparing Dragon's Dogma 2 to? Like, Skyrim? Like, it's probably not even as good as Skyrim. Like, I have absolutely no faith in this product whatsoever. None. Especially after the controversy that like the community is desperately trying to downplay. The bit with the microtransactions and the fast travel points and like, everybody's working overtime to try to write that off. But like the reality I think is I think it's very clear like what the current situation is that a new game has come out after years and years of begging for it, and people are unwilling to admit to themselves that this game isn't great. I'm getting a lot of flashbacks to how like Starfield was like revealed when it first came out, how like people really seriously thought it was like a game of the year contender, but over like the the launch window period, people began to realize that like, wow, this game it's really, really, really boring, right? To the point where like it was so bad that it didn't even get like nominated for like any notable Game of the Year awards, and nobody cared, right? Starfield had no appeal, none to anybody, and Dragon's Dogma 2 is kind of the same way, right? It's coasting by its reputation as being like a Capcom product, right? People don't want to admit that Capcom is bad now, right? Because Capcom's one of the only reasons that anybody buys a platform that isn't Nintendo. There is no there's no willingness from the community to acknowledge the fact that Capcom games have been getting worse, that they can't compete with Nintendo games, that Princess Peach Showtime probably outperformed Dragon's Dogma 2. It was definitely more cost effective, right? Like, there's definitely this very stubborn refusal to kind of acknowledge, like, the problems that Dragon's Dogma 2 has had at launch, right? You know, I've heard issues with the frame rate and the PC version, and, like, uh, there was the bit with the microtransactions, right? Like, to me, it couldn't be more obvious that this game is a dud, right? But again, we're doing the Armored Core 6 thing. We're doing like the Pretendo thing of just like, oh, it's better than what Nintendo could put out. It's one of the best games there. No, it's not. Like again, one of the things I really want to emphasize here, and like this is the reason I'm frustrated with this and Rise of the Ronin, right? Um, if these mediocre action games came out on Nintendo hardware, like that people would be coming after it, right? We saw this with Princess Peach Showtime, right? Which was a game way better than both of those. With that game, all anybody could talk about was like, oh, it's too easy. Oh, it's a kid's game. Oh, it doesn't have enough depth to it. Oh, it has no replay value. Oh, it's gonna be too short. Like they tried all this nonsense, but like the reality of the situation is that Princess Peach Showtime was a phenomenal game, right? There's no getting around it. There is no downplaying it. Like everybody's trying to do this thing right now where they're like, "Oh, this is going to be a hidden gem on Switch. It's a shame it's not going to sell well." Right? Like we saw this with Arlo, right? Where like he covered the demo and he's just like, "Oh, that demo wasn't very good." Like everybody did this thing where they pretended the demo wasn't good. Like same with Contra. Like they did this thing where they pretended the demo wasn't good, and then suddenly the game comes out and it's just like, oh, I guess the game is good. Like again, like why are people willing to be so overly critical of genuinely good Nintendo games while doing everything you possibly can to damage control for nonsense like Dragon's Dogma 2, like Baldur's Gate 3, like Street Fighter 6, Tekken 8, you know, like Forspoken, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Like, why do we keep going through this like cycle over and over and over again? Why is everybody crying about how Nintendo is like disappointing you near constantly, but then turn around and like praise Dragon's Dogma 2 just because it exists. No, like screw that. Dragon's Dogma 2 is not a good game. The developers behind Dragon's Dogma 2 have never produced a good game. Devil May Cry 5 was trash. Devil May Cry 4 was trash. Devil May Cry 3 was trash. Devil May Cry 2 is one of the worst games I've ever played in my life. Like, why can we not acknowledge that the creators behind these games are not talented individuals and do not deserve our attention or respect?